Welcome to The Deepest Cut, a podcast about the movement from painful experiences to meaningful music. I'm your host, Matt Connor. This feels silly to say since it's something we all understand, but I'll do it anyway. The heart is important. When we deeply desire something, we say that we have our heart set on it. When we put so much into ourselves, into a project, we say we've poured our heart into it, or that we've done it with all of our heart. When there's an important promise to be kept, we cross our heart. And when we want something deeply rooted within us, we take it to heart. I say all of this because I think Andy Gullahorn is onto something when he says that songwriting, for him, is the fastest way to connect to his heart. That feels important. As we host these discussions on The Deepest Cut, about the process of writing from vulnerable spaces or dark moments, we're ultimately talking about mining what's inside. In other words, what's at work in the heart of the artist. With an extensive catalog of songs, somewhere between 500 to 1,000, he says, Andy is an ideal interview subject to discuss this process with. As an artist so in touch with his own heart, his own motivations, his own joys and fears, Andy's songs are really shared stories. And honestly, I could easily name a dozen or more off the top of my head that have found me at a pivotal time and brought me to a new place of healing or understanding. For this episode of The Deepest Cut, I sat down with Andy to discuss a progression of songs that he wrote that were birthed from the deeply felt pain of a close friend and a house with an empty nursery where twins were supposed to be. It's a conversation about mining the depths of the heart and yet bleeding responsibly for the sake of the audience. There's a lot to learn here, and we hope you'll enjoy this episode. Here's our conversation with singer-songwriter Andy Gullahorn. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Deepest Cut. My name is Matt Connor, and I'm your host. I just said we're, like all of me, in the plural, is glad to be here with Andy Gullahorn. Andy, how are you? How are all of you, by the way?
All of me, we are great, and we are excited to be here with all of you.
Hey, I appreciate you carving out the time and space to be here. Today we're talking about a song in particular called Grand Canyon, which comes from an album Beyond the Frame. But in general, I wanted to start this idea of working through difficult or painful circumstances with songwriting. I already spoke with your wife, Jill, for another episode of the podcast, and I wanted to start with just how many songs are in the catalog anyway. She couldn't even venture a guess. She's like, I have no idea. I don't even know how many albums I have, let alone songs. So it was basically pleading the fifth. I just wonder if you knew how many songs you'd written total as a songwriter, like for yourself, for others. I know you do co-writes all the time. Do you have even a figure there?
I don't really know. I guess it would be somewhere between 500 and 1,000. That's a pretty big range, maybe. I mean, I've been writing since I was 16 or 17 years old. There might be 3 good ones in there, but I think it might be over 500 total.
Yeah, it's a lot. When I first approached you about this episode, this idea of talking about maybe some of the more difficult songs to work through, you were real game for it. I mean, pretty quickly, I think you were the first person to get back with me like, yeah, sounds good. We can do that. I think for other people, they've actually been less amenable to the idea. Like, well, wait, what do you want to talk about? And how difficult is this going to be? And I wanted to start there with you, wondering, like, do you feel like, I think even your songs lend themselves to such vulnerability. I mean, I've just been along for the whole catalog anyway, but like, do you feel pretty open about going to difficult places overall and maybe not so precious about maybe that's a vague or muddy question, but I think you kind of get what I'm saying.
I feel like I've always been comfortable going into a hard place. I mean, it's easier going to a hard place with somebody else, like in mind, thinking of somebody else. But There are a couple answers to your question. One is I've always looked at my songs as a way of, if my, after I die, my kids go back and listen to the songs, which they probably won't. If they did, I'd want them to have a clear picture of what I was like. So I want to be honest in that way. But also, if I had any enemies or people that I've hurt over the years, if they went back and listened to it, not that they would be like, oh, I'm not hurt anymore, but it would be more like, oh, well, he wasn't pretending to be something that he wasn't. So kind of being honest and vulnerable is important to me in that way. On the flip side of that, I had a conversation with a friend years ago, Teresa McBean. She's a pastor of a recovery church in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. We're talking about kind of writing styles, a difference between me and Jill, my wife, who is a little bit more private. And I was just kind of like, well, I'm an open book. I'll share anything, and thinking that was a great virtue. And she said, well, you know why that is? And I was like, why? She said, you have terrible boundaries. And I was like, oh, okay. Or maybe she said, you have no boundaries or something like that. And I was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. So, it's the good and the shadow together. So that goes to say, when you asked me, would you be willing to share one of the most difficult songs? I was like, oh yeah, I'm game. Partly because I was like, well, if there was one that was like really too personal, I just wouldn't share it. But there are other ones that are fairly personal that I can share. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, have you ever written a song that you deemed too personal to put on an album or like out there for public consumption?
I think so, but not because I was necessarily scared that it was too personal, just that it didn't feel like it was for anybody else other than me. It was just processing something that was good for me, but even commercially or just for somebody to enjoy it, for me to play it live or to release it would just be like bleeding on the audience and making them be my therapist, which they don't need to do. So there are definitely some songs like that are really personal processing songs. They're not really meant for public consumption, but it's not out of fear of being exposed necessarily. To me, it's just more trying to be kind.
I know we want to talk about Grand Canyon in particular, but even there, it sounds like you've learned some lessons about like, hey, there's a responsibility for me not to quote bleed all over the audience, etc. You mentioned like 500 to 1,000 songs, like that's a lot. That's a deep well of experience to learn from. Can you say like what you have learned about, hey, when I am dealing with personal, difficult material, mine or someone else's, this is what I believe to be important about the handling of that?
I think it's songwriting for me is very therapeutic. And in some ways, I would say that it is the fastest way to be connected with my heart, because I don't feel like I'm connected with my heart very easily. So I turn to songwriting to do that, to connect with my heart. So I'm game. Primarily writing the songs is for that. And then if one of those songs happens to be one that I feel like could be helpful to somebody else, then I have no problem sharing that with people. But I do think there's a responsibility to not, when I say like bleed all over the audience, I don't want to use somebody else to get what I need through playing a song, whether that's attention or maybe fishing for some kind of affirmation or somebody to. I just don't think that's what a song is for. So I try to be careful with that. And a lot of that is played out just through the mixture of being a songwriter and traveling around and playing my songs for people. You just realize some songs are helpful and useful, and some songs are not as helpful in that setting. And so in that setting, I want to play songs that I feel like would help me feel connected to other people, help other people feel like they're not alone, and not to do it so that I can vent about something. And that'd be another thing. Another big rule for me is that I don't want to write even processing songs that are really pointing the finger at somebody and are telling somebody else how they need to change, because that always seems to like be a bad decision for the future. It will always come back and boomerang back around and hit me somewhere. So I would always try to write something from a place of compassion or empathy, mostly because when it does come back around, I want to have compassion and empathy for myself. So those would be kind of the things where I don't want to play a song just because I need something out of the audience for it. And I'm not going to, you know, well, I'm not going to say I never point fingers. Sometimes I do, especially in a song that's trying to be funny or sarcastic or something. I feel way more comfortable doing that, but hopefully it's in a gentle way.
Sure, sure. Can you take me into Grand Canyon? What's the story behind the song there? I know you wrote it adjacent to someone else, right? Like not out of your own experience, but observing closely the experience of a friend or family member.
Yeah, my friend Nate Tasker, singer songwriter. We were writing a number of songs for a project he was working on that was himself diving into his grief of losing twins. So we would get together a number of times and write just different songs about his experience, all different aspects of that experience. And I just really love that he was brave enough to do that, to take something that tragic, to dive back into those waters and be like, I want to see what comes out, diving into my grief. And I was honored that he took me along for that ride. So we wrote a number of songs together. One time, it's right up here in this room. He was sitting right over here, and I said, okay, so what's the song we need to write today? And he said, well, we need to write the song about how I feel like God completely abandoned me in that time. And I asked him a few questions about, like, tell me what that looked like practically. And I remember him telling me about going to the memorial service at the church. It was the first time he's in a church since they died. And they had their footprints, like from the hospital, the baby's footprints on the program or bulletin or whatever it is, the program. And he remembered going into that church and thinking, okay, God's going to be here. At least I feel like God's abandoned me, but this is God's home. He's going to be here. And he remembered going in there for the memorial service and feeling like God still wasn't there. And he talked about the first meal that he and his wife had after all the meals from the community stopped coming. I don't know how many weeks or months that was, but when that runs out, eventually you're going to have your first meal that you have to make for yourself. And just down the hall is a nursery that was ready for 2 babies that's empty, and talked about how he felt like God was abandoned him in that moment too. So I was just honored by his stories and his willingness to go into the pain. And so out of that conversation, we wrote a song called Nowhere to Be Found. And it's just about how it felt like God was nowhere to be found. And I love that song. It was really meaningful to me. And I played it. It's a song that I wrote on piano. And I played it one time at Laity Lodge, which I know, well, a lot of songs come out of that place. But at a concert, I was sitting there playing that song. And I get to the end of it. And just holding out a chord on the piano, which I don't play piano very often. So it's kind of awkward. I don't know what to do with my hands, like when I'm done, or, it's just an awkward space. And it's a really sad song. It's kind of a dark, sad song. Nowhere to Be Found was. And I finished it and nobody clapped. And I just wasn't sure, like, what do I do? I'm just sitting here at the piano. I'm going to have to get up and walk over and pick up a guitar. It's just awkward. It felt right that nobody clapped. It wasn't like oh, yay, he's nowhere to be found. This is fantastic. It felt like the silence was honoring the space that the song came out of, But I felt this both practically from a performance standpoint. I was sitting there and I was like, I wish there was something else I could go into. Almost to, not that I want to just jump out of the sadness and relieve that, but it just felt like it was longing for whatever the next step was. Like, that song should go into another song. And so just that I took that feeling of this feels unsettled and just said, well, if it was going to go to another song, what's the next step out of that? And we were really careful in writing all those songs with Nate. It was really important to not tie things up in a bow or to be like, oh, here's the meaning of this or whatever, to try to jump out of the sadness and the dark period of it. So I didn't want to do that, but I was like, what is a way that I could come out of a situation like that and not be like, oh, it's all better, but what's the next step? Just one tiny little step. And it just felt like what that step was to say, kind of like, I don't know what this is going to be like, but I know, all I know is it's not going to be like this forever. I don't know what the future is going to be like, but at least it's not going to be this for forever, which is hope, but it's not like, it's a very small dose of hope. It's just like, I'm not going to say it's all, I'm not going to fix it. But so that's where Grand Canyon came from. So it just kind of started with the verses. There are endless tears and suffering we can't explain. There are dark gray clouds that never seem to drift away. There's despair in the morning that will tie us to the bed. And all of those lines felt like it was still in the place of nowhere to be found. It's just staying in that place of, this is hard. And then it's just one line, but the story isn't over yet. I was like, okay. And then so every verse was just kind of built upon that. It's just like, okay, I'm going to go back to the there's a white flag raised saying we can't bear anymore. There are silent nights because nothing's like it was. In our dreams we tell the sadness so we cannot forget. So all the verses were just more hammering on that hard thing, but the story isn't over yet. I felt like that was a step forward in hope, but it didn't feel like it was tying things up in a bow and fixing it. Just saying, I don't know what that next step looks like, but it's not always going to look like this. And then I honestly don't know where the Grand Canyon, structurally for a song, it's really different. I mean, you have two verses, then like a half chorus, then you have another verse, then you have a full chorus. So I don't have a memory of how that happened, but it wasn't like, oh, I have an idea. In the second chorus, I'm going to be like the Grand Canyon stretches way beyond the frame or something like that. It was just like, really was starting in those dark places in the verses. And then by the time I got to the first chorus is just kind of when I wanted to zoom out of the intense, intimate pain. I wanted to zoom out as far as I could, like be in it in the verses and zoom out as much as I could in the chorus. And so when I think about zooming out, I'm like, oh, what's something that's really big? Zoom. And I was like, oh, the Grand Canyon. And so then that happened. So all the verses were, kept going back to the particular pain and then zooming out, which I think is a hard thing for me to do in the midst of particular pain, is to zoom out. And I don't think you have to do that. But like when I look at a particular pain at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, it just looks way different than when I'm standing at the bottom of the canyon staring at it. So that was healing for me. And I can say that I wrote that song for Nate, but really all the songs that I write for other people, it's still really selfish. It's still just me trying to put myself in his shoes and like, how would I navigate this if I was in that situation? And then by doing that, there are times where I end up in similar situations and the songs help me through it just because I try to enter into it with somebody else. Sorry, I just talked for a long time.
No, it's great. It's great. When you write a line like "There's despair in the morning that ties us to the bed," were you thinking of Nate and trying to put yourself in his shoes, or are you also referencing your own? Like, oh yeah, I've had my own despair.
Yeah, totally. I think even with nowhere to be found, Nate would tell me specific stories, and then I would write things around it and be like, hey, does that feel true? Like, because I'm superimposing my own story on it. So the despair in the morning that will tie us to the bed is like, I don't know if everybody knows that feeling, but just where there's so much stuff happening, you really feel like there's a weighted blanket on you, but not in a good way. It's just like you are, the thought of getting up and doing something is just too much. So yeah, that's a process of, that's not him telling me, oh, when we went through this, I just couldn't get out of bed. It's just me saying, man, if I was there, this is one of the ways I would feel. I would just feel like, yeah, like, what's the point of me getting up, But it really is kind of taking, like using that story, his story and his life as a lens to look through. But I'm looking through with my own experience and just being like, oh, this is what it would feel like for me. So in a sense, it's processing something that both I haven't been through before, but also I have been through before, like in other things. My body has felt that way. You feel loss and you feel sadness and you feel grief. So it's just helping me kind of tie those things that I have felt before in with, feeling the pain of another person.
By the way, have you been to the Grand Canyon?
I have.
I didn't know if you were referencing something that you just thought.
No, yeah. I mean, I love the Grand Canyon. I went in high school, I think, and then Jill and I played a show in Arizona years ago. I think after I had written the song, she'd never been, and we had like an afternoon, so we just drove, you know, to the closest point and looked out, and didn't have much time. But I could sit out in places where I can sit and I feel really small. I could be there all day long. There's something about that kind of, maybe it's like that for everybody. I don't know anybody who's been to the Grand Canyon and was like, yeah, it was all right. But it's a really holy thing for me to sit somewhere like that and feel small in the best way. Have you been to the Grand Canyon?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, it's the same thing, right?
Did you hate it? Was it just like, oh, whatever? You threw a paper airplane off and you left?
Yeah, we were so bored. Oh yeah. I threw an apple core over the edge and I walked back in the car. No, yeah, I marveling at something bigger than me is always a place that I appreciate being. Want to be there, whether it's just alone on a beach, in some place, or on a cliff. I'm obviously it's always outdoors and some, like, not staring at my laptop, which is most days.
It's not in the Oculus.
It's not in the Oculus, though. Hey, by the way, did you take that song to Nate before anyone else? Did you say, "Hey, I actually wrote a little bit further, and here it is," and how was that?
Yeah, I played it for him. I think I sent it to him. He hated it. I'm just kidding.
Like he hates the Grand Canyon too, I'm assuming.
Yeah, he's like, oh, Grand Canyon. He's Australian. He's like, oh, I'm tired of hearing about the United States. No, I don't. I know that I sent it to him. That's one of the things that, with songs like that are kind of vulnerable, where I'm taking a lot of liberty writing a song in response to somebody else's story. And I remember the first few times I did it, I would feel this overwhelming thing of like, I should send this song to this person. But then I was like, oh, that feels, I don't know, like, oh, I think it's so special that you get a song for me. I was like, that's not what I want to go for. I was like, that's a weird space. Be like, oh, here's a gift. It's a song from me. But early on, I kind of learned to trust that, or push through the fear, and would send songs to people like that I was like, hey, I don't know if this is what it's like. I'm just kind of imagining, and here's what came out. And the more I started to send songs to people, the feedback at least wasn't, that was horrible and it ruined my life. People seem to appreciate it and really like find healing in it too. So just over the years, I just gained a little bit of confidence. Not like, oh, the song is so great, but like, for this person, maybe nobody else will ever hear Grand Canyon, but it was like, here's a song that I wrote that is forever tied to your story, and here it is. So I don't feel as nervous about. I still feel nervous when I do it. I don't feel as nervous about it as I used to, because I'm like, oh well, it really doesn't feel like I'm boosting myself up, or I'm trying to make somebody like my music. I just feel like, oh well, this song was a gift to me, and the gift to me was out of your story. So thank you for that gift, and here's a way of me saying thank you.
It sounds like you've learned lessons about the gift of shared stories and what they mean to you and to others.
Yeah, and some of that just comes from when people do that with me and share their stories with me, and I can see myself in their story. It's like, it helps me give language and to organize my thoughts and feelings around my own story. And in that sense, it makes it. That's why I'm okay giving those song, like handing the song off to the person, because it doesn't really feel like it's mine. It feels like it's ours. It feels like the shared story kind of belongs to everybody, and I'm just grateful for it.
Well, for those listening, stay tuned. Here is Grand Canyon by Andy Gullahorn.
There are endless tears and suffering we can't explain. There are dark gray clouds that never seem to drift away. There's despair in the morning that will tie us to the bed, but the story isn't over yet. There's a white flag raised, saying we can't bear anymore. There are silent nights 'cause nothing's like it was. And our dreams retell the sadness, so we cannot forget. But the story isn't over yet. I took a picture of the Grand Canyon so I could remember that day. There are cards and letters, all letting their love be heard. Sympathetic smiles from those that are lost for words. In our wake, there are whispers that tell of where we've been, but the story isn't over yet. Picture of the Grand Canyon so I could remember that day. Oh, but the beauty of the Grand Canyon stretches way beyond the frame. There's too much weighing on my mind, and there's a bird out there still singing in the dead of night, like it knows there's a season when the sun's gonna set, but the story isn't over yet. The story isn't over.
You've been listening to The Deepest Cut, part of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. Audio production and theme music by Isaac Vining. Logo and identity work by Meg Cook. The Deepest Cut was created and hosted by me, Matt Connor. Thank you so much for listening.